AI זה חשוב, אבל שמעתם פעם על HI? בחברת הפינטק אינטואיט, שפיתחה פלטפורמה מבוססת AI לניהול תשלומים שמשרתת כבר 100 מיליון לקוחות ברחבי העולם, מאמינים שהעתיד טמון דווקא ב-Human Intelligence, ולכן במרכז הפיתוח שלה בישראל מגייסים את מהנדסי התוכנה וחוקרי הדאטה החדים והחריפים ביותר, שנהנים מסביבת עבודה שמשלבת בין היציבות של חברה גלובלית רווחית לבין החדשנות של סטארט-אפ. אם אתם כאלה בדיוק, חפשו בגוגל אינטואיט ישראל Careers. שלום וברוכים הבאים לעושים היסטוריה מארחת. והפעם, דן קרלין, מגיש הפודקאסט Hardcore History. רשת עושים היסטוריה.
רשת עושים היסטוריה.
רשת עושים היסטוריה.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
עושים היסטוריה עם רן לוי.
שלום. הפרק הזה של עושים היסטוריה מארחת הוא קצת שונה מהרגיל. בדרך כלל, כשאני בוחר את המרואיינים שאני רוצה להביא לתוכנית, אני חושב עליכם, המאזינים. מה יעניין אתכם? מה יפתיע ומה יסקרן אתכם? הפעם לעומת זאת, תשמעו, אין לי דרך קלה לומר זאת. זה לא אתם, זה אני. דן קרלין הוא אחד היוצרים הנערצים עליי ביותר, פחות או יותר מאז ששמעתי את הפרק הראשון של הפודקאסט שלו. לכן, כשפנתה אליי כוכב הקמיר, אשת יחסי הציבור של הוצאת כתר, והציע לי לראיין את דן לרגל פרסום המהדורה העברית של ספרו הקץ תמיד קרוב, אני מודה שלא ממש שאלתי את עצמי על אילו נושאים אני ארצה לשוחח איתו ולמה. פשוט אמרתי, כן, בטח. לשמחתי, כשפרסמתי בעמוד הפייסבוק של עושים היסטוריה, שאני עומד לראיין את דן קרלין, התגובות שלכם המאזינים היו נלהבות לא פחות משלי. מסתבר שאני לא המעריץ היחיד שלו כנראה. קיבלתי מכם עשרות הצעות לשאלות ולנושאי שיחה עם דן, ומתוכם בחרתי כמה שאלות שתשמעו בראיון מיד. אוקיי, אז לטובת מי שלא מכירים, על מה כל המהומה? אז קרלין החל את הקריירה שלו כעיתונאי ופרשן פוליטי בערוצי רדיו וטלוויזיה אמריקניים. ב-2006, זמן לא רב יחסית לאחר המצאתה של המדיה החדשה של הפודקאסטים, ובערך שנה לפני שאני התחלתי להקליט את הפודקאסטים שלי, קרלין החליט להגשים חלום ישן שלו וליצור תוכנית בשם Hardcore History, שתעסוק בדברים שבאמת מעניינים אותו. מלחמות, פוליטיקה, זעזועים היסטוריים ודמויות היסטוריות כבירות כגון אלכסנדר הגדול, צ'רצ'יל, סטלין וכדומה. לומר ש-Hardcore History הייתה הצלחה, זה יהיה ממש, אבל ממש understatement. אנחנו מדברים על פודקאסט שזוכה למיליוני הורדות לכל פרק. לפי ויקיפדיה, פרק אחד שפרסם דן במאי 2015 זכה לכ-350,000 האזנות בתוך פחות מ-24 שעות. אני יכול להקריא לכם במשך כמה וכמה דקות טובות את רשימת הפרסים והתארים שהוא קיבל לאורך השנים על התוכנית שלו, אבל אני אסתפק בנתון אחד. המגזין סלייט בחר באחד הפרקים של קרלין על החזית המזרחית במלחמת העולם השנייה לפודקאסט החמישי הטוב ביותר בכל הזמנים. אם אתם שואלים אותי, הם טעו. הפרק הזה הוא לדעתי הפרק הטוב ביותר בכל הזמנים, ובוודאות הפרק הכי טוב שאני אי פעם האזנתי לו, ותאמינו לי, הקשבתי להרבה פודקאסטים. ואתם יודעים מה הכי מפתיע בסיפור של קרלין? שהתוכנית שלו, Hardcore History, היא אנטיתזה מוחלטת לכל מה שהמדיה המסורתית מחשיבה לתוכנית שיש לה סיכוי להצליח. מדובר בתוכנית על היסטוריה, שזה כבר, אתם יודעים, משעמם, שיש בה רק דובר יחיד, אין בה כמעט בכלל ראיונות, אין כמעט בכלל מוזיקה, אין כמעט בכלל אפקטים, ואורך כל פרק, אתם יושבים, אורכם של הפרקים נע בין 2 ל-6 שעות תמימות. לפרק. אחד. כשאנשים שואלים אותי, אז מה הכללים לפודקאסט מוצלח? אני מצביע על Hardcore History ואומר להם שאין כללים. צריך פשוט לספר סיפור ולספר אותו טוב, וקרלין לדעתי הוא אולי הסטורי-טלר הטוב ביותר בעולם כיום. אז בשיחה שתשמעו מיד, שוחחתי עם דן על הרעיונות שבבסיס הספר החדש שלו, על איך מספרים סיפור היסטורי טוב, על האהבה שלו להיסטוריה, על בחירת הנושאים שלו, וכמובן שגם שאלתי אותו מתי, אם בכלל, יעשה פרק של Hardcore History על אחת ממלחמות ישראל. האזנה נעימה.
שלום לכל המאזינות ולכל המאזינים, אני עטילה שומפלבי. הנה עובדה, בכל שנה יותר ויותר חרדים מצטרפים לתנועת היוצאים בשאלה. הנה עוד עובדה, הקושי הוא אישי, ולא פוחת ככל שהתנועה הזו של היציאה בשאלה גדלה. איך אני יודע את זה? הפודקאסט החדש של עמותת הלל נקרא יוצאים בשאלה. בכל פרק נדבר עם שני יוצאים בשאלה, כל אחד עם סיפור שונה. בכל פעם נתמקד בבעיה אחרת שמתרחשת במהלך התהליך המורכב הזה, מתוך נקודת מבטו של כל אחד ואחת מהם. חיפשו בכל אפליקציות הפודקאסטים, יוצאים בשאלה, ואני מבטיח לכם שכל פרק ישאיר אתכם פעורי פה. יוצאים בשאלה, הפודקאסט של עמותת הלל.
Hi and welcome to Making History. I've got with me a very special guest today, Dan Carline from Hardcore History. Hi, Dan.
How are you?
Thank you very much. It's a great honor and a thrill to be talking to you. And the occasion of our conversation today is because the Hebrew translation of your book, The End is Always Near, has just recently been published in Israel. I read it I think I finished it like in straight 5 hours, non-stop reading. It was fantastically great. And we'll talk a bit about your book and like the ideas and why you wrote it. And then we'll maybe head on to more general questions. And finally, questions that the listeners of Making History have sent to me to ask you.
Sounds fantastic.
Great. So the first question is, why write a book? I mean, you're a well-known podcaster, very, very successful. What does a book offer to you as a creator, as an amateur historian who writes about history that the media of podcasting does not?
Well, I think that's a great question. I think it explains why we didn't write a book even earlier. Also, because I think when we talk about one's own personal strong points and weak points, I'm a verbal person. And so, as a matter of fact, one of the things I always say I learned from the book a little bit is my weaknesses in other, I'm a newcomer when it comes to writing a book. And it was weird to feel like such a newbie compared to, at this point, I've been a person whose verbal skills have been something I've been honing for decades and decades and decades. It was very strange being sort of a rookie, as we would say here again. But I had people for a long time convincing me we would be able to reach new audiences and people. One of the things especially that we get asked about are foreign translations. So people would like to either record my shows in a foreign language or have transcripts that are translated to a foreign language. And that's never been possible because, well, first of all, if you ever read a transcript of my shows, they're embarrassing. I mean, they don't even, they're not even complete sentences. I mean, they really don't transcribe well. And then it would be very difficult, I think, for somebody else to record my voice in their voice and have it come out in a way that we were happy with, and who would check it? I mean, you'd have to have people in all the different countries that wanted your work in another language checking the work. So it was too difficult to do. And one of the arguments that the book publishers made is that this would open avenues for people who don't speak English or don't speak English very well to access your work. So a perfect example would be a book that comes out in Hebrew. And so that was the argument that was made at the time. And it's a good one, but I will say that it is a very different challenge than doing a podcast that's just audio.
Okay, so on to the book itself. The End is Always Near focuses, as the title suggests, on the various ways in which our civilization can come to an end. Why choose this topic
in particular? What's in the apocalypse that kind of fascinates you personally?
Well, it was a bit like that psychological ink blot test for me to try to figure out what to do the book on. And I had editors and agents and a whole lot of people, once we signed the book deal, helping me, because as I had started off the conversation, I'm a newbie, I'm a rookie, I haven't done this before. So they were trying to help me find the path, because people who write books all the time know how to do this. And one of the things that they said to do was they said, well, get out all the shows you've ever done and look at the subject matter that you've chosen and try to find threads that connect the subject matter. And one of the things I always like to ruminate on a little bit, and I've boiled it down to a little phrase, but the phrase was, are ruins a thing of the past? So are big cities lying in ruin something we're not going to see anymore? Or is that a normal part of the human existence? Will people 500 or 1,000 years from now be picking through where we used to live, opening up our graves and testing our dead? And so it stems sort of from this fascination. We also use I say Twilight Zone because I think Rod Serling of the Twilight Zone actually wrote the scene from Planet of the Apes, the movie. I love that scene where they see the Statue of Liberty sticking out of the sand. And to me, that symbolizes something, right? That same thought, could our society ever fall into ruins? Or the question I always ask is, do you think our society will ever end? And I liked the answer either way. If you say, yes, it's going to end, that's fascinating. If you say, no, that's a cycle of history that's done now, and it's never going to end again, that's fascinating too. So that became sort of the fork in the intellectual road that powered the idea behind the book, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Actually, I had an interesting conversation with an archaeologist, and I asked him, what will be the things that will survive 5,000 years from now? And he said mostly nothing, because we'll hardly use any paper, and digital information doesn't survive that much. So it might be that we are in a kind of we'll be in the kind of a dark ages for these archaeologists. So I
remember my mother was wondering if they're gonna be able to translate Microsoft Word or something. They're gonna need a Rosetta Stone or some version of a Rosetta Stone to do that in the future, to unlock our digital archives.
It will be difficult work for them, that's for sure. Now, one of the most, I don't know if call it amazing or funny or ironic things, is that the Hebrew translation came out just recently, and of course we had the last year in the coronavirus pandemic, and a good portion of the book talks about plagues and pandemics and humanity's reactions to them. And naturally, you wrote it before the COVID pandemic. Now, how have your views and your notions regarding the topic that you wrote about just relatively short time ago changed, if at all, following what you actually could see with your own eyes as for the reaction of humanity to a global pandemic? Has that changed your views in any way?
It's funny. It was another Israeli reporter who asked me about that and said, do you feel like you got lucky? And I said, no. I said, that would feel like a terrible thing to say you got lucky predicting a global pandemic. But the truth is that I'm not a Nostradamus. I was simply quoting or talking about things that many, many people, Bill Gates just off the tip of my tongue, but lots of people have been predicting for a long time that one of these avian flus or swine flus or something like that, maybe even something more like Ebola or another hemorrhagic fever, that something like this was going to break out into a larger area. And then it was going to be up to our science and all those kinds of things to see if we could deal with it. It is a little strange that the title of the chapter, I'm going from memory here, but I think it's called Pandemic Prologue ? And then it was about 4 months after release that we were in it. So the funny thing about it, and you'll be able to, I'm sure, relate to this, is that, I always get accused of taking too long on the podcasts, but a book had a real hard deadline. If I had spent as much time as I wanted to spend on the book we would have missed the predicting of the pandemic. I would have still been writing that chapter when and it would have lost some of its relevancy. I think I would have had to have redone the whole thing. But to answer your question, I look at it as a very, very interesting experiment, because it's fascinating that even with all of our modern technologies and capabilities, it shut us down the way it did. And I think if you had polled a bunch of experts before the pandemic hit, I think you would have had a decent number of them that would have thought it wouldn't have. So I find it very interesting that, sometimes you can have these theoretical discussions and then all of a sudden something happens and they're no longer theoretical, right? So it's interesting to get some real data on something like this. Although, obviously, heartbreaking. But if we're going to have the heartbreak, I'm interested in whatever lessons we might have learned as a little bit of a compensation for that.
Okay, so let's switch gears here and talk about your personal fascination with history. And it'd be very interesting to hear from you when this fascination began. What drove it?
I get this question periodically now because of the history podcast. And I have to say, I cannot date it. My mother thinks I was born this way, but I have my own theory after doing the history podcast now for years. I think some people, and it's a decent number of people, it's not a rare quality. I think a decent number of human beings are born liking history. And I think what makes them able to do that is they're inherently able to, whether you're reading a book or watching a movie or whatever it might be, to put yourself into the past a little bit. A lot of people, though, can't do that. I compare it to meditation. I can't meditate. I mean, some people, you can read a book or watch a YouTube video and all of a sudden they're meditating. But other people need to have somebody stand behind them and sort of guide them into it, right? Think about this, do that, play some music, really set it up. And then once they learn, they can take themselves back there and do it themselves. I feel like people who are naturally into history are equivalent of people who can just meditate without even thinking about it. And other people need somebody to sort of teach them how to get into that proper sense so that they can appreciate it. But once they do that, then they can return and do it the rest of their lives. I always describe our podcast as an appetizer for history. And we help guide people into how do you feel empathetic for people from a long time ago? How do you try to do the impossible, because it is impossible, and walk a little bit in their shoes? These are the sorts of ways I sometimes describe what we do in the podcast, but it's related to just what you mentioned. The fact that some people are born liking history and have that ability, the same way that some people are born liking math, just have that ability, and some people don't. I was born it's been the overriding interest of my life. I became a journalist because they say about journalism that it's the first draft of history. I wanted to be where historical events were taking place, right? The guy who's reporting with a microphone when the Hindenburg explodes into flame, So for me, I think this is, if there's a history gene, I'd say about 20% of the population has it, and I have it too. So it's a from birth kind of thing, born this way. Some people's brains work in a mathematical way, right? Some people's brains work in a musical way. For me, the way I organize reality is in a linear sense, right? This happened, then this happened, then this happened. And I thought that's how everyone did it until I met a computer scientist who was a genius. But we would talk, and I realized that he comes at everything from a very different vantage point than I do. His brain is literally processing reality through a different lens than mine is. And that's when I realized, okay, so I'm doing a history show for both people like myself, but also people that need a little mathematics explained or a little music explained so that they can understand it better. And then I've found that once you give them the way, you teach them to meditate, they don't need you so much anymore. Then they can pick up the books and relate and learn how to empathize and get a sense of that. So I mean, I feel like when I'm talking to other history people, that I'm speaking to people that are just like me. And then when I'm speaking to the math and the computer science and the music people, that I'm translating sometimes a little bit for them. I do think that history is something that I think it's easier for people who are into history to get into other cultures, because I think if you can't get into other cultures, well, the entire historical world is another culture. Even your own society 50 years ago is another culture. So I think there's definitely some cultural, some ability to relate to very different cultures, but I wouldn't call that imagination. Empathy, though, might be something that's involved.
Last year, you took part in an innovative virtual reality production. Very interesting to learn about such a new project. So what was this project about, if you can tell us, if you're allowed to? And, as a follow-up question, what have you learned from it? What are the advantages, if any, of virtual reality for creators and, teachers in general, perhaps?
Well, I'll tell the story here. I don't think I've ever told the true story of how I was introduced to virtual reality, but I want to make sure I give credit where it's due. But it's going to sound a little like name dropping, so I apologize. So it was music. It's a famous music producer named Rick Rubin who introduced me to virtual reality. Rick is one of these people. I don't think I've ever met anybody in my life, and I don't know where he finds the time, who is so up on the latest creative projects and things people are doing, and different ways to express yourself artistically. I've always called him, he's sort of a creativity amplifier. And I remember he said to me one day, I want to show you something. And he took me over to this guy's house, who's a very famous person in the virtual reality field. But this was before anybody had the systems at their house or anything like that. And he took me over to this guy's house, and they put the goggles on me and the whole thing. And I remember walking out of the house with Rick afterwards, and he said, "What are you thinking?" And I said, "I can't even narrow it down to one thought, because things were pinging in my head over all the ways that you could use this technology to do just what you and I were talking about earlier. How do you take people who find it hard to relate to the past through, say, the written word, and immerse them in it in a way where you don't even have to have much of an imagination to feel, and I looked at it as just the most amazing storytelling tool. And I don't think we've yet even scratched the surface of what it can do. I mean, I remember the guy whose house we were at explaining to me that eventually they're going to remake all the greatest movies of all time in virtual reality. So try imagining Star Wars, but instead of seeing it on a screen, you're in it. Things like that. But it was all about this idea of ways to tell stories in a more immersive sort of context. So that's how it started. So then when other people brought a proposal to me about doing this, I had already sort of been primed. I knew what they were talking about. I'd had some contact with it. And I remember the people I was working with had said, well, okay, if we have this technology, what is it you want to show? And I'm always interested, and I always say this with the podcast, on the extremes of the human experience, right? What are these things that people have lived through and seen? And this is not a tangent, but I mean, I'd always wondered about things like tsunamis. And when I was a kid, no one who hadn't actually seen a tsunami knew what one looked like. Well, nowadays, of course, we have cameras and cell phones and surveillance monitors and everything else. You can go look at YouTube movies of what a tsunami looks like. But what does the burning of a ancient city look like, or the sacking of any? So, I mean, I looked at the virtual reality as a way to all of a sudden have a chance to see or portray some of these extremes of the human experience in a way that allowed people to have some empathy and some sense. Obviously these are all, I mean, we did our virtual reality on the First World War, but you're not getting shot in it, right? You're not losing a leg. You're not seeing a buddy killed. So there's and as I said, you wouldn't want to, right? If I charged you to buy a ticket to go see my virtual reality and you had a chance of getting your leg shot off, you're probably not going to buy a ticket. Right. So there is a limit to where you want to draw the line. But the goal is always, I think, to get a little bit closer. And to me, the virtual reality just was a tool that was so fantastic. And I feel like over time, maybe I'll do some more in that realm as a way of trying to see how close we can get towards immersing people in those kinds of stories in ways that make it more real to them.
So let's turn to our listeners' questions, and I really had to filter them because I had literally hundreds. First one, Arya Shapira asks, what's the secret of telling a fascinating 4 hours long story? What's your secret sauce?
My dad made movies. That's what he did. He was a film producer, and he used to have a saying, and he was talking about scripts, movie scripts. And he used to say that he wanted what he called entertainment value every 3 pages. So there had to be something every 3 pages that grabbed the viewer. Because if you went longer than 3 pages in his mind, it was too long. And so what I always try to do with these stories we put together, and so just so your audience knows, we don't write these stories. There's no script for what I do. So it was actually Rick Rubin who called what I do edited performance art. It's improvised. And so what we always try to do, and then what happens is once the improvisation breaks down, we stop for the day and then we edit by putting today's work next to tomorrow's work, and we put it together. So my goal was always to make sure that any segment or chunk that we recorded was in and of itself interesting, that it had enough pieces in it that were that grabbed your attention or your interest or made you think. And we figured, we're not always right about this, but we figured that if each segment has something compelling in it, that when you string the segments together, it should be continually compelling. So if you're on hour number 3 and we recorded that in a 25-minute segment, the part you're listening to, we wanted to make sure that 25 minutes had its compelling bits in it, and the previous 25 minutes had its compelling bit, so that when you string them together, there should theoretically be entertainment value every 3 pages all along the way. So I can't say that it's a formula necessarily, but I do feel like when I listen sometimes to playback, if we go too long and my mind is wandering or I'm all of a sudden disinterested, that's a segment we throw away, that something went wrong there. So we do have to continually monitor to make sure that we're not going too far between compelling or emotionally invigorating. I mean, I want your emotions to be involved. And so I try not to get in, when we have periods of narrative history or expositions, either I break them up with things that touch other buttons in your psyche or soul, or we interlace them. I always compare it to like making a rope, where you have multiple strands that you're weaving together, and one of those strands has to be your emotions, and another strand has to be your intellectual stimulation, another strand has to be the narrative storyline. So when you weave all these things together, we're constantly trying to make sure that the balance is there, and that we're not making you go too long without pushing one of those stimulating buttons on you. Does that make sense? I think oral storytellers throughout all of history have had these same sorts of concerns. How do you not lose the audience, right?
Yeah. For me, the most astonishing part is that it's not pre-written. I mean, it's all basically, as you say, improvised.
I don't know if we were starting today that we would do it that way. We never planned to do 4-hour podcasts. So I mean, it's funny how the evolution of something takes over, and all of a sudden, I mean, you could compare it to being trapped. I mean, you're almost trapped in the way it worked out. But I will say that it has made it sound very different than most other people's podcasts, and it's very hard to imitate because of that. So.
Exactly. Okay, next question. Itamar Weisberg asks, what topic or period did you find the most challenging to research or write about?
Oh, there's 2 answers to that one, and they differ. The first one is that it is always difficult to work with very early periods in history, although I'm fascinated with the ancient period and the really early history. But you lack the source material sometimes, right? So what you're missing from a storytelling standpoint are the firsthand accounts, right? So if I want to tell a story about something going on amongst the ancient Hittites, there's a little bit of stuff, but there's not much where you could say, and Joe the Hittite said this in his writings. And, whereas if I'm talking about the First World War, you're overwhelmed with the number of firsthand accounts you can pull from. You have the opposite problem. And so the earlier you go, or when you deal with tribal societies that don't write, it becomes difficult to get their version of events in their voice. And so that makes it tougher for me as a storyteller because you lack some of the sources. Now, there's another side to that, though, which is my shortcomings. So I'll often get people who will say something like, why won't you talk about 17th century India? I would really like to hear you talk about 17th century India. And I have to tell those people, I would love to talk about that, but I don't know enough about it. And I can't learn enough about it between shows. So all the subjects that we've talked about are things that once upon a time I was very interested in. And I built a foundation of knowledge so that when we decide to talk about it in a podcast, I can begin to build new knowledge off of that already existing foundation, right? I can update my information because history is always being refined, reinterpreted, updated, and I can begin to build outward from that. And so the toughest things for me are things that I don't already have that foundation, or my foundation is incomplete. But it means I can't just go decide I'm going to talk about something I have no knowledge of and research it, and 4 or 5 months later come out with a 4-hour podcast on it. It would sound like I didn't know anything, So those are the two things: lack of sources and lack of knowledge on my part.
I can very much relate to the lack of sources because, we talked about the strands in the rope that you're weaving. I think that if you lack the first-hand accounts, you're missing a lot of emotions in the story.
Yes, you miss the human side.
Exactly, the human side is lost. I can relate to that. Now, many, many listeners, I'm talking about lots of listeners, Itamar, Dror Ellen, Alejandro, and many, many more asked, when, if at all, are you going to talk about any of Israel's past wars, such as the Yom Kippur War of 1973?
פעם, כשהייתי טינג'ר, למדתי לנגן על גיטרה. אבל תכלס, אחרי 30 שנה, הדבר היחיד שאני עוד זוכה לנגן זה יונתן הקטן. היום, אחרי כמה וכמה שיעורים פרטיים בטונליין, חזרתי לעניינים. הגשמתי חלום, והיום אני מנגן ומופיע בלהקת רוק. שלום קיסריה!
אדוני, זה ארומה פה. אתה רוצה להזמין משהו?
טוב, יש עוד כמה חלומות להגשים. אבל ברצינות, טונליין פיתחה שיטת לימוד ייחודית בשם לימוד היברידי, אידיאלית לאנשים עסוקים כמוני. שיעורי אונליין מקוצרים בני 30 דקות, למידה עצמית מחומרים כתובים ושיעורי וידאו מוקלטים. השיטה של טונליין פתחה לי ולעוד מאות תלמידים כמוני דלת קסמים נסתרת לעולם הנפלא של המוזיקה. אז אל תוותרו על החלום שלכם. חפשו טונליין בטט בגוגל, ספרו להם שהגעתם דרך רשת עושים היסטוריה ותקבלו שיעור ניסיון בחינם, ואם תרשמו גם מתנת הצטרפות מדליקה. יש גם תוכניות מיוחדות לילדים בשילוב אפליקציות משחק מובילות וללא תוספת תשלום. טונליין, מגשימים חלומות לאנשים עסוקים.
Oh, okay. Well, let's go down two paths with this one too. Because first of all, I would love to try, because the approach we always take is to try to walk a little bit in the other guy's shoes, right, and to try to give a 3-dimensional perspective. And it would be an interesting experiment to see if I could pull that off with something that is still got so many sides to the story, and that those sides are so emotionally charged. Let me compare it to something. I often hear from Irish listeners who want me to talk about the period in Irish history that's called the Troubles, which is
struggle against the British.
I was trying to figure out the right terms to use. Yeah. But I have the same problems with that. I would like to figure out a way to see if I could balance out all the different emotionally charged perspectives in that as well. The main reason, though, is much more to do with how recent they are. if you look back at my catalog of shows, and I'm going from memory here, so I could be wrong, I think the only show where we came up that close to modern times was we had done the early history of nuclear weapons, and we took it up to the Cuban Missile Crisis. So that's early 1960s, but that's as far. A lot of Americans want me to do the Vietnam War, and we haven't done that yet for the same reasons. It's so recent, so that you get to two problems. One is that you don't have enough, and this is the classic history problem, right? You're too close to the events. You haven't had enough time for things to be worked out. And you're dealing with a balancing act here. The balancing act is you want to be far enough away so that the emotions have cooled enough so you can have a sort of a dispassionate view of an event. At the same time, the very fact that it is a dispassionate view takes you away from the emotional feelings of the people in that era, right? So you want to be able to have both of those things at the same time, a historical sweet spot, if you will. In answer to your question, I think I would like to try, and I think the late 60s, early 70s is probably an era we could fool around with and see how it goes, because it's a challenge. But it's not that I'm deliberately ignoring those. Those are actually some of the most interesting times to me. And we're getting up to the time period, as you had said earlier, where I'm actually a conscious human being with some of these things in my memory banks. So that brings me other things that I can potentially draw on and add to the story with. But there's no conscientious decision to avoid these things. It's just
too recent.
It's recent, and yet as the years go on, they're becoming less and less recent. Right? We started this podcast 15 years ago. 15 years ago, 1973 was 15 years closer to us than it is now. So it might be interesting to experiment and see how it went. It might be more. It might be interesting to go to the 47 war and maybe the 56 war rather than the 67 or the 73 one. But I don't know yet. It would be fascinating to try. Like I said, I would be interested to see if using our standard techniques here, we could do it in a way that people appreciated. I'm not sure we can. It's one of those sorts of topics. It is interesting, though, once again, to relate it back to something we spoke earlier, that this is such a global medium. When I used to be on radio, if I wanted to talk about some news that was going on in Iran, the worst thing that would happen to me when I got off the radio is I might have a call from somebody who used to live in Iran who would tell me I got it all wrong. If I do that today, I'm going to get 150 emails from Iranians living in Iran right now saying I got it wrong. So it does provide an interesting level.
There's no escaping.
There's no escaping. Maybe
everywhere.
Yes, maybe that's the best. You're doomed maybe with some of these topics.
So, Amnon Carmel asked, in your podcasts, you often talk about periods of great change, such as the fall of the Roman and British empires. Looking around us now, do you think we are witnessing such a period in history, aka the fall of the great U.S. empire, for example?
I think that's a great question. And I thought about it a lot, and I don't have like a one answer for that. I'll say this: sometimes societies can't fall unless somebody pushes them. So if you think about, I can look back on history and see certain societies that probably could have been extinct had there been someone strong enough to destroy them, but because there wasn't, they continued. When I was a kid, I don't think they teach it this way anymore. When I was a kid, they used to say that Hellenistic society had become stale, right? That was the way they described it, sort of stale, non-growing, non-transforming, and that the Romans, by essentially ending that age, opened up the door to transformation and new things and novelties and all that. I would suggest that if you use that sort of a criteria, the United States can't fall unless there's an internal revolution from within, or an external conquest from without. I don't see external conquest happening. The other possibility is perhaps possible. I would say this, and let's call this a theory in progress, because as you're watching reality unfold in real time, we don't have the benefit of the 50, 75, 100 years that a historian would like to write a history. It's more the first draft of history of the journalist. But here's what I think I see. I think I see transformation in the U.S. system, and I think it is a multi-decade-long process. One of the problems I always have with the discussion of politics here in the U.S. is everyone thinks one or two presidential administrations in the past, and that's as far back as they go. But many of the trends here in the United States, I think you can trace to the Second World War, maybe even the first, but certainly the second, which created the U.S. as a global superpower, and us trying to deal with everything that implies. It's changed us domestically an awful lot, and I think you could perhaps tie in even the riots or the insurrection at the U.S. Capitol several months ago to this unraveling. I would say that even the Second World War and the discovery of the atomic bomb changed the powers of the U.S. presidency, changed the balance in our constitutional history from one where we had three branches of government that are supposed to be co-equal branches to an extra strong presidency. They wrote a book about it in the late 60s, early 70s called The Imperial Presidency. I think you're seeing the last 4 or 5 decades and the effect that it's had on our political system changing the United States. I don't think we know what it's changing it into. Maybe we'll look back on it down the road and say it was a positive thing, that it changed it into something that better fit the needs of the 21st century and our needs now. But of course, as a history fan, I'm inclined to look at it a bit more negatively and suggest that we're seeing an unraveling. And since Americans, like most other people, romanticize the past, yours truly included, I think we're losing something. But I don't know what it is we're losing, and I don't know what it is we're gaining in trade-off for that. I think, though, that I don't know if I would call it in the old terms of rising and falling. It depends on your conception of what we lost and what we're gaining. But I certainly think, and listen, to say that the U.S. is transforming is a bit silly because every society is transforming all the time. But I think in major constitutional ways that open up the door to all sorts of, let's call it potential disorders or dysfunctions or, that insurrection that you saw at the Capitol recently, I don't think would have been possible to imagine 25 years ago. So I think the fact that the changes that we're undergoing, that are decades-long changes in this country, have opened up the door to something that would have been unimaginable before. Go look at the Roman Republic's history, though. They saw a similar thing. All of a sudden, you had generals with Roman troops marching on Roman cities and killing Roman citizens in ways that were appalling. But a generation after that, everyone was unfortunately quite accustomed to it. So I would say that the U.S. is involved in a multi-decades-long transition, the destination of which is unclear.
Very interesting. I would have thought that you would mention the internet as a kind of force driving towards a kind of rapid change, maybe too rapid.
First of all, you're 1,000% right, but I don't consider that a specifically U.S. phenomenon. I think that the internet, and maybe even, maybe we could single out one particular aspect of the internet, the social media question. I think that's providing a challenge globally. I think from a governmental standpoint, it is, and this almost gets back to our toughness question when we're talking about how do we evolve to deal with new stresses and strains, and what happens if we don't evolve fast or quickly enough. It is interesting. I was having a conversation with someone recently where we were comparing the longevity of the value of experience recently. So we were talking about how a person living 1,000 years ago who had learned all the tricks of life in their world, that their wisdom, their accrued experience would have had a longer shelf life than our accrued experience today. My children are 19 and 16, and they are already helping their parents navigate the changing internet. And I would suggest that my oldest daughter is probably only about 5 years away from needing help because of the pace of change. And so I think the fact that 1,000 years ago, a farmer in what's now Israel would have been able to pass on skills and experiences to his children that would have been valuable to them well into his old age, that is less and less the case because of the speed of change. And what does that do to a society when we all have to either stay on top of ever-changing skills as the mind becomes less plastic and less supple, or how much we have to rely on increasingly younger people driving the directions that we go in? I mean, the Roman senators were all of a certain age in ancient Rome for a reason. They provided stability and experience and wisdom and all these things. Well, what happens if those people are out of touch now, and the modern equivalents would have to be, if we wanted the right people in there, 25, 24, 23, 22. It reminds me of stories I read during the Black Death, where they said that so many of the experienced older people were dying off that all of a sudden you had teenagers in positions of authority and whatnot, because that was what was left. So so to answer your question, yes, the internet's the huge thing, but that affects us all equally, I would think. Maybe not North Korea.
Nothing affects North Korea.
That's right. North Korea is insulated.
No, but you're totally right. I think the thinking about the older generation of people who should be leading us being out of touch is something that maybe lots of people don't take into account.
Oh, if I gave you the ages of some of the most powerful U.S. political figures, they're definitely in the Alzheimer's age group. I mean, we have a lot of octogenarians, and the president's not an octogenarian yet, but he's about 2 years away from it. A ton of the important senators and congressmen are. I think 100 years ago, that probably was less of a problem than it is now. But they're all making legislative decisions on technology that they do not use or understand daily.
Yeah. The pipes of the internet. I remember the famous...
The pipes of the internet.
The pipes of the internet.
That's right. That's right. How funny.
Okay, one final question. Two of our listeners, Dvir Wee and Eyal Tirosh, asked, you often describe the smallest details of an event, such as the hardships of daily lives of soldiers in the World War I trenches. Many of these details can be very psychologically disturbing. Were you affected by reading and talking about such disturbing details? They add, how can you sleep at night?
Oh, okay, let me go. Once again, it's a two-pronged answer. The first part is, when I was a news reporter, I thought for a while that I wanted to be a war correspondent, and this was going to be where I was going to end up. And for years now, I've been reading the work of war correspondents, and the more of the work of theirs that I read, the more I realize how blessed I am to not have become a war correspondent for that exact reason. I think about the images that are trapped in those people's minds that they have to try at night to purge from their memory banks, and so I got lucky on that against everything that if you'd come to me at 25, I would have said, no, I really want to do that. At 55, I realized that I was saved a terrible, maybe PTSD, a post-traumatic stress syndrome from not doing that. So that's one answer. The other one, though, is something my wife brings up to me all the time. We'll be in the room and she'll turn on some modern day drama where they will be dramatizing something horrible. Somebody being raped or somebody being killed or some child being abused, and I have to walk out of the room. And she says to me all the time, how do you have to walk out of the room when that's all you're talking about on the podcast all the time? And I don't know what the difference is between me reading about something 100 years ago or me seeing it dramatically played out on television by an actor. I don't have an answer to that, but the answer is that I am affected by it, but strangely enough, not in my own work. I don't know why that is.
Dan, Caroline, thank you very much for this conversation. It was a thrill and an honor. Fantastic.
The honor is all mine, and thank you for giving me a chance to speak to the audience in Israel. I mean, as I said, to get back to what the great advantage of the book was, that I get a chance to talk to you and your audience about things like this. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you very much. And of course, I highly recommend the book, guys. It's called in Hebrew, הסוף תמיד קרוב. The end is always near. And it's an amazing book. I read it faster than everything. Thank you very much, Dan.
Thank you, and please stay in touch, my friend. I'd appreciate it.
In this house, we obey the laws of thermodynamics.
לפודקאסטים נוספים ולהצטרפות לרשימת התפוצה של התוכנית, בקרו באתר הבית של רשת עושים היסטוריה, בכתובת ranlevy.com או הורידו את אפליקציית רשת עושים היסטוריה שבחנות האפליקציות של אנדרואיד.